Hi guys, welcome to this video on FITT Principles. This video is all about the principles that you might want to use in order to help you plan an exercise program, whether that's for yourself or for somebody else. Let's take a look. So the first thing to note about the FITT Principles is that word there, FIT, is actually an acronym. Those letters stand for things. So they stand for F is frequency, I intensity, T time, and the last T is type. So frequency, intensity, time, and type. And these are essentially, at a fairly basic level, the four kind of key things that you need to be thinking about when you're planning an exercise program for someone, whether that's yourself or somebody else. So frequency, intensity, time, and type. So frequency simply means how often. How often is that person going to be exercising? So how many sessions per week? That would be the normal way of phrasing it. So how many sessions per week? Is it 2 sessions a week, 3 sessions a week, 4 sessions a week? How many sessions a week are we talking about? And that is obviously going to be led by the person that you're making the program for. It may depend on their age, it may depend on their current level of fitness, and so on. Lots of other factors that need to be taken into account when deciding how often that person should be exercising. The government guidelines, of course, in the UK are that we should get 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week as adults. So you can split those up into different sessions. So how many sessions per week would you plan in a particular program? So frequency is important. How many sessions have you got to work with? Secondly, intensity. In those sessions, how hard do you want your client or yourself to be exercising? How hard does it have to be? Okay, so intensity simply means how hard is the exercise going to be in those sessions. And these things might interplay with one another a little bit. You may have one session a week where you have really high intensity work and a couple of sessions where the intensity is a little bit lower. And again, that's going to depend on what components of fitness you're targeting, what you're trying to achieve from the program, and all other issues to do with the client's personal and individual needs as well. But how hard is measured in a bunch of different ways. Some ways we could measure it include heart rate, beats per minute. So the heart rate is a good indication of how hard a person is working in their given exercise. We could also measure in terms of the resistance. So what I mean by that is the heavier the weight, the higher the intensity. The greater the weight, the more the resistance, the higher the intensity, the harder it is to lift that weight or to move that weight. And we also have something called RPE, which is one way of measuring what's known as perceived exertion. So RPE stands for the rating of perceived exertion, and it's a bit of a subjective thing as it's individually based. It's not, you don't take a measurement per se. It's not like heart rate that you can strap someone up to a monitor and figure out exactly what their heart rate is. But RPE is their perception of how hard they're working. So you can ask them for a number from 0 to 10, or more commonly a number on what's known as the Borg scale, which is a scale from 6 to 20, whereas 20 is absolutely flat out, can't carry on. You might ask them to give you a number that indicates how hard they feel they're working. So how hard do we want them to work? Well, that's going to be a key part of our planning. So we need to pitch the intensity just right. How hard do we want them to work? So how often? Frequency. How hard? Intensity. Time is for each session. How long do we want them to be working for? So the intensity and the frequency are important, but how long is each session going to be? And within each session, if there are separate, for example, you're doing a circuit, how long do you want them to spend at each point on that circuit, at each station? So how long is an important consideration. So in terms of time, but also how long in terms of sets and reps. So it might be that you're doing bicep curls, for example. And so the number of reps is the number of times you would complete the bicep curl. Let's say you were going to do 10 reps. So you would do 10 reps and then you'd stop and break for a little bit. And if you did that again, you did another 10 reps after a break, you'd be doing a second set. So sets and reps simply means the sets is the number of times you repeat let me rephrase that. Reps is short for repetition. So repetitions is the number of times you do the exercise in a single bout. And then you might have a break. So during your work period, you might do 10 reps of a bicep curl, then you have a little break, and then you do another 10 reps, and then have another break, and then do another 10. So you'll have done 3 sets of 10 reps, making a total of 30 reps in all. Okay, so sets and reps are also an important way of, or an essential part really, if you're going to be doing resistance training, an essential part of your planning. You've got to include it in your program to know how many sets and how many reps, at what weight, and how long each one is going to be lasting for. So how long is an important consideration. So you could measure it in terms of time if you're going out for a jog or a run or something, or if you're doing a circuit, or you could measure it in sets and reps. So frequency, how often; intensity, how hard; time, how long; and then type is fairly obvious. What kind of exercise are we talking about? There's all sorts of things you could choose from. And again, these are going to be dependent on the preferences of your client, or whether it's yourself you're making the program for. They're going to depend on access to facilities. It's going to be dependent on interests. All sorts of things are going to come into play. All sorts of factors will come into play at this point. So type includes, it might be aerobic exercise that you're doing, it might be swimming, or it might be cycling, or it might be jogging, or resistance exercise, or some kind of interval exercise, which would be suitable for lots of sports like football and hockey and basketball and so on. So there's lots of different types of exercise, and even within those sort of types, there's different sorts even within those types as well. So there's absolutely loads of different types of exercise you could do, and this is something else that you need to consider when you're putting together a program, an exercise program for a client. So those are the key things in the FITT principles. F, frequency, so how often; intensity, how hard do you want them to work in each of those sessions; how long do you want them to work for. That's both in the length of the session itself, but also within those sessions, sets and reps, for example, or even intervals within the session, the work and rest ratios, that sort of thing. And then also, obviously, then type. What do you actually want them to be doing? Are they going to be doing some aerobic work? Is it resistance work? Is it interval work? And so on. So those are the key FITT principles. Let's just take a moment just to apply them really briefly. So in terms of applying our FITT principles, what I want to point out is, of the 4 principles, there's probably 2 that are the most key. They're all important, of course, but the 2 that are most key in terms of determining what outcomes you're going to get are the 2 in the middle. So intensity and time. I've just labelled it as duration on this slide though. So the interplay between the intensity of the exercise, so how hard it is, and the duration of that exercise, that's going to be the critical factor that determines the adaptations targeted. What I mean by that is, if you're trying to achieve power as an outcome of your program, you're going to have to change the intensity and duration so that the intensity is super high, but the duration tends to be much lower. Because you can't really, it's very difficult to have super high intensity and super high duration, because we just run out of energy. So if you're targeting power or speed or something like that, you might have super high intensity, but in terms of the duration, it might be short and sharp and snappy. So the interplay between intensity and duration for speed and power is going to be different compared to, for example, if we're trying to work on aerobic endurance. In those cases, if we're looking to work on aerobic endurance, the intensity is going to come down and the duration is going to go up. So we're going to go for a longer duration, 60 minutes, 70, 80, 90 minutes, but the intensity will be a lot lower. So you won't be working as intense, let's say if you're doing some running. So you could, with high intensity and short duration, you could run, and that could look like sprinting. And sprinting would therefore make you faster. You're working on power, you're working on speed. But with running, you could do the opposite. You could go more slowly, but for a much longer period of time. And in that case, the adaptation that you're targeting by doing that will be aerobic endurance. So this interplay between intensity and duration is really the key thing. By balancing those 2 things out, and sometimes you can sort of balance them in the middle as well, where you can have moderate intensity and moderate duration, and get things like muscular endurance. This interplay is really the key thing out of these 4 principles in the FITT Principles model. So what might that look like? So it might possibly look, as an example, in a program. You might plan a program where you are expecting somebody to make some small gains, some small improvements in their aerobic endurance. In which case, you might, as far as the FITT principles are concerned, you might ask them to 3 times a week, that's frequency, work at about 40% of their VO2 max. I'll come back to that in a second. And you might want them to do that for 60 minutes. And you might want them to achieve those 60 minutes 3 times a week simply by walking. So this is obviously dependent on the client or the individual that we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about somebody who's advanced in years, who perhaps is new to exercise or hasn't done any exercise in a long time. This might be an appropriate overview of a plan for them, an overview of a program for them. 3 times a week would be ideal. 60 minutes of walking. It's going to be low intensity, of course, but the duration therefore can be, up to 60 minutes. We're looking at an hour of walking. So we can have the duration a little bit higher because the intensity is nice and low. So in terms of intensity here, I've put 40% of VO2 max. Now VO2 max is a measure of how much oxygen we can uptake and use per kilogram of our body weight, which is not super helpful really for most people. If you don't have the equipment available to measure it, it's not all that useful. So you'll remember that I said there's other ways to measure intensity, and one of those is the rating of perceived exertion. So I'm going to switch this out. I'm going to swap 40% of VO2 max, which is a relatively low or light intensity. I'm going to change it for a rating of perceived exertion of 10. So remember that this is on the Borg scale, which runs from 6 to 20. So we're still fairly light in terms of the intensity and the exertion that we're asking this person to do in this program. We're going to say that their rating of perceived exertion needs to be kept at around about 10. So we've tried to balance the intensity and the duration in order to get the adaptation we're looking for, which is some gentle aerobic endurance improvements over the course of, let's say they were going to do this 3 times a week for 10 weeks or something like that. We'd then start to see some improvements in their aerobic endurance. So we can target a particular adaptation by using the FITT principles, and especially by focusing on the balance between intensity and time, or intensity and duration. And just to round this off, what's important to remember is the whole point of the FITT principles is that they can be used to plan and to manage appropriate levels of overload for each individual. So it's absolutely essential that the FITT principles are used with an individual's specific needs in mind. The FITT principles are not intended to be off the shelf. You don't just select something that someone else has made for a different client, for a different person. You have to take into account and into consideration the person that the program is for, and make sure it's pitched at the right level so that they're just reaching what we call overload, so that they're just above what their bodies can handle comfortably, so that we're progressing, so that we're pushing their bodies to adapt and to change over time in a positive direction. That's what we mean when we say overload. So these FITT principles, really helpful basic principles, and there's lots more we could say about the principles of fitness programming, but the FITT principles are a really good place to start. Frequency, intensity, time, and type. And the idea is you take the individual and apply these principles to that individual to bring them on in the fitness component, or the set of fitness components that they are looking to improve on, by overloading them from the point where they're at and just bringing them on a little bit further each time. Over time, of course, as your client or as you yourself become increasingly fit, according to whichever component of fitness you're trying to work on, as you improve, you'll need to go back to the FITT principles and tweak them and change them so that you're constantly just pushing yourself into overload so that you can continue to improve. So that's it for FITT principles. Frequency, intensity, time, and type, a really good way just to get started thinking about how to make a fitness or an exercise program for either yourself or somebody else. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe so you get notified every time I upload new material. If you've got any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and I will definitely get back to you in time. Other than that, take care for now. See you in the next video.